All right, friends, today we are studying the book of Esther. Esther is such an interesting book. It actually historically happens between the chapters of Ezra 6 and 7. We have Esther, who is a Jew, and she is growing up in this enemy territory. We have this overly powerful king. He is literally the ruler of the world in their eyes. The king Ahasuerus is very powerful. The first chapter is literally setting up his power and his glory. It talks about in verse 3 that they have this ginormous feast and they have this party, and it is a 6-month party. It is displaying his royal power, his wealth to celebrate for that long, to have that much food and wine for that long. It talks about how everything is in fine gold and silver in verse 6, and there were white and green and blue hangings, and just everything is beautiful and fine. In verse 8, we learn that he is an intoxicated person, and he's been drinking and feasting for 6 months. He is very powerful, and he is power hungry. The end of verse 8 says that they should do according to every man's pleasure. They are very into satisfying their physical desires. They have no restrictions right now during this time. Everything belongs to the king. Verse 9 tells us that also Vashti, the queen, made a feast for the women in the royal house, which belonged to the king Ahasuerus. So everything belongs to him. And what happens is that he wants to bring in Queen Vashti, and he wants her to be objectified. She is this trophy wife. He wants to bring her in and everybody look at her. And she says no. In verse 12, but the queen Vashti refused to come to the king's commandment by his chamberlains. Therefore was the king very wroth with his anger burned against him. She knows her worth, and she will not bow down to anybody. The narrator of this story is setting up this patriarchal society where women are this lowly status. They are just objects. We need to understand what Esther is coming up against and feel her angst, and this is setting it up for us. So, back to Vashti. Well, the king is pretty ticked that he is rejected and that she does not come. And so he goes to his advisors and he says to them in verse 15, what are we going to do with her according to the law? So he wants to hide his anger and his choices behind the law. He is refusing her agency. He's rejecting her morality. He is trying to save face among his other people. His counselors convince him to put out a royal decree in verse 19 that it becomes a law. And remember, the laws cannot be altered once they're made. That Vashti doesn't come before the king anymore, and that she is going to have her own royal estate, and he's going to have somebody better than her. And then in verse 20, and when the king's decree, which he shall make published throughout the empire, for it is great, all the wives shall give to their husbands honor, both great and small. This is a forced honor. There is no respect here. And that is what we are coming into. In chapter 2, after everything has settled and the decree has gone out, there's a moment where we wonder if maybe King Ahasuerus is feeling a little bit of regret for his choices, just a little bit of remorse. He is still objectifying women. He is still very shallow and self-serving. In verse 4, he decides that he is going to find a new wife that is pleasing unto him. And this is where we meet our Esther. Verse 7, we learn that her name actually wasn't Esther. Esther is the name that is given to her. There's talk about if this is a Persian name, that because it is similar to one of their gods, the goddess of love, Ishtar, and they might have been trying to associate her with Persia. Remember, they wanted to bring them in and indoctrinate them into their ways. And that is a possibility of why her name is changed from Hadassah in verse 7 to Esther. Mordecai may have also been a name change. Hadassah would have meant myrtle tree, which is peace and rest. Esther in the Jewish would have been to hide or conceal. And in Persia, again, it's that idea of this goddess. And she was very beautiful. She was an orphan. Her parents had both died, and Mordecai, her uncle, took her in and raised her as his own. Mordecai is from the tribe of the Benjamites, and if you remember, they were the small tribe that was almost completely wiped out. Esther is taken in with all of the other virgins and brought into the king, and it says in verse 9 that she pleased him and she obtained kindness of him. And so he chose her right away and put her into the 12 months of purification. Mordecai, we learn the sweet pattern of him in verses 10, well, really through multiple chapters, but he constantly checks on her. He is at the palace to make sure that she is okay. He wants to be her provider and her protector. Take this into consideration. In order to be in his presence, they have to go through an entire year of rituals and cleanliness, and they are given 6 months with oil of myrrh, which is that idea of sacrifice. Myrrh is one of the gifts that was brought to the baby Jesus. And they have 6 months of sweet odors, and that is a reminder of prayer. Remember the odors and the incense that went from the temples up to God. It takes an entire year for them to be cleansed enough to be in the presence of the king. So when she is going to go in later with an immediate desire, there's got to be a lot of pressure on her. In verse 13, we learn that whatsoever was desired of these women, it was given to them. And Esther was not like the rest of the women. We learn in the next few verses that she is very humble. She knows who she is. She doesn't see a reason to be anything more than she is. She doesn't need all the extra pampering. Verse 15, it tells us that she required nothing but what Haggai, the king's chamberlain and keeper of the women, appointed. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all who looked upon her. Verse 17, the king loves her. She obtained grace and favor in the sight more than any of the other virgins, and so set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And then in 18, he has another big feast. 19, we come back to Mordecai. We find him sitting at the king's gate. Now, if you'll remember, gates are symbolic of judgment, authority, decision, and this idea of covenant access. So he is sitting there, he is doing those judgments, and he is trying to help Queen Esther. In fact, he tells her, hey, don't tell them who you are yet. By being at the gate and being in this place of authority, he overhears a plot on the king. He is able to tell Queen Esther about it. She is able to save the king's life. Chapter 3 is where we meet Haman. And Haman is being promoted. That's the first thing we learn about him. So he is also a power-hungry man. He wants everybody to bow down to him. He wants everybody to know how great he is. Mordecai will not bow down to Haman. Mordecai instead tells who he is, of his Jewish heritage, and who God is, which is interesting because in this whole book, the name of God is never mentioned. Well, Haman is pretty upset with the world and the fact that Mordecai will not bow down to him, and he goes into the king and says, hey, we've got this group of troublemakers, and he's very general about who it is. And we have to wonder later, when the king knows that Mordecai is a Jew, if this is the reason why he is so vague. He says in verse 8 that there are this group of people, they're different, they're lawbreakers, they don't have any value, and they're not helping us. In fact, in verse 9, he says, I will give this large sum of money to help take them down because it will be nothing compared to what we get back from them. It also tells us how much money Haman has and how much he is willing to give for his own pride. Well, we know the story. The king is swayed and he has this law written, this decree. Everybody has seen this decree that the Jews are going to all be killed, and he wipes them all out in one day. That's the plan. This chapter ends with the city Shushan being perplexed. They have never had any problem with the Jews. They are concerned as to why this change in this decree has come out. Now, if we're taking this into our lives, chapter 3 is the mess of our lives, when everything is confusing and everything seems impossible. Actually, chapters 3, 4, 5, all of those, we assume that God isn't working and that he is silent because we can't see him. And we're going to find out that in reality, he's preparing this miracle long before we ever needed it. Remember in Isaiah 45:2 that he has promised that he will go before our face. This is one of the beautiful parts of this whole book, is as we are looking back, we actually see God everywhere, even though he's never mentioned by name. When we go to chapter 4, Mordecai is perceived that all this was done. Mordecai rent his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes, and he went out in the midst of the city and cried with a loud, bitter cry. He is in mourning, and that verb perceived makes us wonder if he is cognizant that maybe this was his fault, that Haman, if he had just bowed down to Haman, if he had just given in to Haman like all the other people, would this have happened? If you notice, he cries out in a loud voice. He is in mourning. And as we go through the next couple of verses, what we find out is, who are they crying to? Who are they fasting unto? And it's beautiful that even though his name is never given, we know who they are praying to. We know who they are fasting to. It is God. He goes and talks to Esther, and Esther wants to know what he is doing and why he is mourning. Mordecai asks her to go to the king and ask for supplication, that she can intercede on behalf of him and her and all of their people. And for her, this is an impossible request. Remember, this is where it comes into play. They had to be cleansed for a whole year before they could see him. He has not come to her or had anything to do with her since he claimed her as queen. And look at what happened to Vashti. She just didn't come to him, and she wants to go in unto him and request this thing of a new king, of a new husband. Pressure on her would have been extreme. In verse 13, and Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all these Jews. That idea of you will be found out. And she responds, verse 14, for if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise from Jews from another place, but thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. He is telling her that the Lord's work won't be frustrated. We won't survive this, but the Lord will save other people through somebody else. So if this isn't something that you can do, it's going to be okay because the Lord is going to take care of it. And then at the end of this verse, in verse 14, who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? This who knoweth speaks of agency and of her choice. God prepared a way, but she gets to choose. Mordecai gets to choose. The people get to choose. Her and her maids, they fast for 3 days. And then they're going to go in unto the king. And she says, if I perish, I perish. We may not have to lay down our life like this, but do we have to perish our social life? Do we have to give up money? Do we have to step away from family or friends? Is it a job that we have to give up? It's that idea of, but if not, I will go into the Lord, and I'm hoping for this, but if not, then I will accept the outcome. Verse 17, we have a role reversal, and there are so many role reversals in this book. Mordecai went on his way and did according to all that Esther had commanded him. So Esther is now the one giving orders. Before it was Mordecai giving the orders. The king gives the order, and here she does. Chapter 5 begins by her putting on the royal apparel. She is going to look the part. She is going to be worthy and prepared to go, as worthy and prepared as she can. And she enters in. And remember, she could be killed just for walking in the room. She enters, and he holds out that golden scepter. And he says to her in verse 3, what wilt thou, Queen Esther, and what is thy request? Shall it be given unto thee even half of the kingdom? This is a reminder that we can go boldly. We know that God holds the scepter, and he doesn't just hold it. He has his arms wide open for us when we are willing to come boldly to his kingdom. Most of us know this story. She says, oh, I've prepared a banquet for you. I would love for you to come. And she invites him and Haman. She's balancing this, I am worthy, and this is God's will. She's balancing this beautifully throughout this. In fact, she's going to say this 3 times. If I have found favor, then come dine with me. If I have found favor, then come dine with me. She's also leaning into their pride, right? Everybody needs to be jealous of Haman, and Haman wants people to see him. It's all about me, 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 me. In fact, when he goes home that night in verses 10 and 11, he talks about how I am this wonderful person. I have these glories and these riches, and even the queen wants me to come and visit, and I am just this wonderful person. Except Mordecai. Mordecai is like this little thorn who will not do what I want him to. And he talks to his wife and to these people, and they are enablers. They tell him to have him killed, to hang him in the gallows. In other translations, it suggests that it is a 75-foot spike. So he wants Mordecai to be an example to everybody else. And Haman himself wants to be very, very high up. Verse 6 has got to be Haman's best moment and his worst moment. 2 things that we should think about here. There are multiple banquets. The king can't sleep. In the waiting is part of our miracle. It gives time for restless nights like the king when he reads the history and remembers Mordecai. It builds relationship. It offers time for our personal revelation, and it allows us to give our will and our timing to God. So chapter 6, the king can't sleep. He has his record bearers bring in the history, and he's reading, and he reads about Mordecai and how Mordecai saved his life. He's like, hey, did we ever do anything for him? So he does have this kind side to him, that he thinks of others and that he wants to do right by others. We don't know if this is a change or if this is what he's like when he's sober, or we just don't know all of his ins and outs, but in this moment, he is thinking of others. What do you do when you can't decide? You talk to your friends. He goes to Haman and he says, hey, I have this person that I would really like to celebrate and honor. What should I do? And Haman, because he is so prideful, thinks, well, this has got to be for me. Who else would he be celebrating in this way? And so he comes in with honor me, give me riches, give me glory, give me power, put the princes below me, make sure that I am seen of men. And in fact, let me be king for the day. And role reversal, Haman is told to do all of those things for Mordecai the Jew in verse 10, which must have been horrible for Haman to hate and despise him so much. But even as he is doing these things, Haman is thinking of what is about to come and how he will be raised above him and have the king's honor. And we find out in verse 12 the differences between these two. Mordecai comes and he goes again to the king's gate. He just has humility, wants to live his life. But Haman hasted to his house mourning and having his head covered. He is so very prideful. His wife gives him a warning. She says, if Mordecai be of the seed of the Jews, before whom thou hast begun to fall, thou hast prevailed against him, but shall surely fall before him. She is giving him a warning of what is about to come. And he does not see it. He just sees his verdict that he has already made, the decree that has already gone out, his righteousness, his highness. And he misses this warning that he could have changed things. Chapter 7 is where Esther comes out and tells the king all that is happening. If you look at verses 3 and 4, you see the word if I have found favor, if it please the king, and then again in 4, but if we have been sold into bondmen. She is setting up not only her station and worthiness before him, but she's also saying, if it had just been slavery, we could handle slavery. We've done that before. Our king, the Lord, will protect us from that. But death, we can't come back from death. She reveals that everybody's going to be killed, her and her people. And the king, Ahasuerus, says, who would do this to you? And she says, of course, it is the enemy is wicked Haman. And Haman was afraid before the king and the queen. So now there's this equal level for the king and the queen working together. The king is so ticked that he goes out into the garden to cool off. And in the meantime, Haman comes and throws himself before the queen and begs for his life. Well, the king walks back in and he sees this moment as Haman trying to objectify the queen and trying to take her. We have that next role reversal. The gallows that Haman built for Mordecai to be hung on are actually what he is hung on. We could end here with the king knowing about this plot and wanting to stop it. So the queen is probably protected. In chapter 8, the king makes all these changes. The king takes off his ring and he gives it to Mordecai. It means that Mordecai is now elevated to power. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. So he's now in charge of everything. Again, that role reversal idea. Verse 3, Esther spake yet again before the king and fell down at his feet and besought him with tears and put away the mischief of Haman the Agagite and his device that he had devised against the Jews. Okay, let's stop just a second there. The Agagite, if you remember King Agag, all the way back in 1 Samuel 15, Saul spared Agag, and here, centuries later, the conflict returns and is finally resolved. The story can't just stop here because nobody is safe. Remember the decree, he can't change it. And she goes into him and says, please figure out a way to save my people. And the king says, well, as you know, queen, I really can't do anything about this. But what he does in verse 10 is he makes a new rule. And so he says, what we can do is all the Jews can gather and they can fight back. So this is becoming a mirror image, whereas before they were just supposed to die. That was all that they could do. Now they can fight back. And who takes this but Mordecai? And he goes out treated as royal. In verse 15, Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in the royal apparel of the blue and the white, and with a great crown of gold, and with garment and fine linen and purple, and the city of Shushan rejoiced with and was glad. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor, and in every province and in every city, whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness and a feast and a good day, and many of the people of the land became Jews, for fear of the Jews fell upon them. When they talk about fear here, this is the godly fear. This is the, you are so happy. You are just so joyous. I want that too. In chapter 9, verse 1, there's a line that says, though it were turned to the contrary. We see Heavenly Father do this over and over and over in the scriptures and in our lives. He turns ash to beauty. He turned the crucifixion into the atonement and into grace and saving. And he does that here where Some people won't even fight because they don't want to. They would rather live with the Jews than have to fight them. They have this big battle. We learn that Mordecai is getting greater and greater, and that people are fearing him, and that they kill all of these enemies. Then said Esther, if it please the king, let it be granted to the Jews which are on Shushan to do tomorrow according unto this day's decree, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged upon the gallows. Why the extra day? We don't know. We don't know what she knew, if there was a revolt being planned. We don't know if there were people who were hiding away on the day it was supposed to happen and planned to come out the next day. We just don't know. Haman's sons are all taken care of. And after all of the killing is over, they begin to rest and they feast in verse 17. And they create a new feast called Adar, a day of gladness and feasting, a day of good, sending portions one to another. And they go from mourning into a day of good, feasting and joy, and sending portions to one another and gifts to the poor in verse 22. So we see this actually repeated. Verse 26, we know that the name of the celebration is Purim. And Purim is interesting because they actually still celebrate that today. And in that holiday, they read this book of Esther, get way into it. And when Haman's name is said, they boo and they hiss. Chapter 10 is just 3 little verses. And there is a change here from our focus on Esther to ending with Mordecai. We are reminded that we need to remember and share our traditions and our knowledge with our children, hence the celebration. What we learn here by ending with Mordecai is that the king is no longer all-powerful. He has Mordecai and he has Esther. And Esther and Mordecai are a type and a shadow of Jesus Christ. And ending with Mordecai, when it's so easy for us to see Esther as a type and shadow of Jesus Christ, allows us to reconsider his part in this and reconsider if he is a type and a shadow of Jesus Christ for all the things that he has done, being the protector, standing at the gate, showing the way, standing up for the right, all of those things. Esther may also be Israel, who goes and fights the battles, but is still protected by the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. It also reminds us of Esther's hidden identity, because sometimes we forget who we are spiritually, and that we, in this mortal world, forget our eternal identity. And President Nelson taught us repeatedly that we are children of the covenant. And if we look at Esther as an example of Israel and Mordecai as the example of Jesus Christ, that type and shadow, we see that hidden identity, when it comes to light, the Lord protects us. He protects us when we are hiding. He protects us when we forget who we are. And when we remember who we are, we can come so much farther because we have him. Esther is such a powerful book because it reminds us and teaches us to recognize God after the fact, until one day we can learn to trust him before the fact. Esther never tells us the Lord said or the angel appeared. Remember when we talked about last week that we have to know the whole story, that we have to know the entire history? That is what we are being invited to do here. We begin to see this evidence that God was in all the ordinary moments, that nobody recognized it at the time. And perhaps one of the reasons that God's name doesn't appear in this book is so that we as readers discover his hand for ourselves. This whole book is God teaching us to recognize his character in the ordinary rhythms of our life. And it is so fitting that Queen Esther, even though she is beautiful and even though she is courageous, she is a queen of the ordinary. Like we've talked about, there's no temple, there's no prophet, there's no miracle in this story. I mean, there's several miracles, but there's no outright miracle told here. There's no angel, there's no prophecy to go on. This is a story of an ordinary woman and an ordinary man, meaning Mordecai, who go in to the king. They have an ordinary family that has had trials, that has had struggles, that has overcome. They don't change themselves. And then what does she do when she invites the king? She invites him into an ordinary thing. Come to a meal. Come to my house. Let's spend this time together. And how does she combat the impossible? With ordinary things. She prays. She fasts. She takes it to the Lord. She counsels with those that she loves and those that she supports. And she truly is able to overcome the impossible with ordinary things. Which leads us to think in our life, How many ordinary moments in my life are actually part of a miracle that I cannot see yet? If I were to change my perspective and ask, where have I already seen the Lord in my life instead of where are you? How would that change our life? And so that is the challenge this week as we are leaving Esther behind, is to think about our life and look for God, to make those records in our journals, to share that with our friends and our family, and to celebrate those ordinary moments where God shows up. Instead of asking, where are you? Find him and share that with other people. As we do, I testify that we will see him in our life and we will know of his goodness and his love for us. Esther is a great place for us to come and visit when we are feeling that God is silent and that we can't find him in our life. Perhaps there is nowhere else in Scripture that we learn more about recognizing the Lord when he seems silent. Esther's story teaches us how to read our own life. Those chapters 3 and 4, that's where it felt impossible. And by 10, we see that nothing is random. Through her story, we learn that faith isn't always seeing God's hand in this present moment. It's trusting that one day we're going to look back and we're going to say, now I understand what he was doing. If you have time this week, sit with this. Think about times in your life where you saw God in your life after the fact, but when you were in the middle of that miracle, it was hard. And maybe you'll understand Esther just a little bit better. And we will find that the God of the ordinary is in our everyday ordinary moments because he loves us. I hope that you have enjoyed Esther. I hope that you see her in a new light, and I hope that you have a wonderful week. May God bless you and keep you.